It wasn't the future that anyone had dreamed of, or even wanted, but it was the one they were stuck with. It was theirs. Hundreds of years ago, kindergartners had drawn pictures of rocket ships. Now, they drew pictures of trees and places where rainwater fell into rivers. Living places. Earth was still the core of it all, but the tendrils of humanity had bloomed from the planet into the galaxy as the decades passed. At first, the interstellar colonies had flourished. Too much, too fast, and the human race had burnt itself out before any of the colonies could truly establish themselves. They fell into decay, into despair. Some colonies were left isolated, while others still clung to their connections with Earth. One by one, they drew the valuable colonies back into the fold, doing it right the second time around. The fractured colonies of Earth slowly began to function. There was one planet, though, that had slipped through Earth's fingers, and the single governing body that ruled wanted it badly. Perfectly situated in the Goldilocks zone, enormous and rich with life, the only downside to the planet that was ever noted was the red, burnt orange light put off by its aging star. It was called Ignatius. A small batch of colonists had been sent to Ignatius in the beginning of the colonization boom, but communication had been lost quite quickly. What they did have, though, were preliminary reports that made it seem like Ignatius was both rich in life and minerals. So, a few dozen people were chosen, a combination of science and military sectors, for a second shot at Ignatius. The criteria were that the new crew had to be effective, but expendable. But the crew didn't need to know that. Once the ship reached Ignatius, they would spend 4 Earth-length weeks on the planet, and then be picked up. That was the gist of it anyway, even if all the details weren't given. It was enough, and no one questioned. Not too much, anyway. There was darkness in the camp. The air glowed coal ember bright, the red light filtering down from the red star above, casting the entire planet in a bloody haze. During the middle of the day, it looked more like Earth, clear and brilliant. But at the beginning and ends of the days, at the sunrise and the gloaming, everything was fire. When the rains came, it was almost impossible to see anything, and the crew sent to live at the camp went back to their outfitter tents to rest, and to take shelter from the unspoken things. For the most part, the fauna was friendly enough. There weren't many traces of the genetics that were used to seed Ignatius the first time around, and the native life was not advanced in any way. It was simple enough to dispatch them humanely, and keep the remains as samples to be taken back to Earth. But there was something stalking the forests, making the leaves of the fat, stout trees shiver. No one had seen it, and no one really cared to. They just counted down the days until they went home to report that Ignatius was suitable enough for habitation. Then something new happened. For the first time since arrival, a siren began to go off, filling the quiet of the day with a warning clarion. It wasn't the camp alarm, but one of the personal pass devices that each crew member wore. Closest to the alert was a botanist, Casey, and his 3 soldier bodyguards, Private Anderson and Lieutenants Parker and Chen. Casey paused, a fuchsia flower in one hand and a collection bag in the other. "What should we do?" "Go back to camp." Parker jerked his head towards the cluster of temporary buildings not too far away. "We'll go see what's going on." The alert was coming from deeper in the forest, and while it wasn't unheard of for someone to go out alone, it wasn't recommended. There was a pathway through the trees, something like a deer trail back on Earth, and they followed it as they closed in on the klaxon alarm call. Then, underneath the din, they heard something else. A deep, guttural clicking and the wet sound of someone's last breaths. They ran, only stopping when they came upon something so out of place that it short-circuited their brains for a moment. It was a shape that instilled fear in them. Terror dredged up from the most primordial parts of their brains. Something that hadn't been seen in eons. Something alien, yet familiar. It was tall, 8 feet or more, and it braced itself on 2 strong legs, a wedge-shaped head bent and tearing at something with vigor. Scaled, it was the color of loam and the green-yellow of bile. 2 smaller arms gripping its prey, holding it steady while the creature ate. Across the spine were what looked like growths at first, but when they peered closer, they were able to see what it really was. Mushrooms. But unlike any mushrooms they had ever seen, they sprouted from the creature, clusters of long and flat caps, their undersides a bright red and speckled with gold. A pale fringe of fleshy tendrils hung from each cap, quivering. The tendrils on the caps closest to the snout reached out and touched the nearly dead scientist being eaten, curious and morbid. It was the middle-aged agronomist, Fred. The creature lifted its head slightly, revealing rows of serrated teeth flecked with blood, and then it opened its jaws in warning. To the horror of the soldiers, they were able to see the last bit of flesh being worked free by twin sets of double tongues. Held barely off the ground in the grip of the monster, the agronomist groaned. There was only half of him left, really, and his guts trailed into the forest floor like so many pink ribbons. A massive hole had been ripped in his side, and now his viscera lay, steaming as the drizzle began to turn into a downpour. Blood flowed into the soil, and the tiny flowers waiting there immediately closed, the rain beating down upon their small red petals. The soldiers opened fire, heedless. Some bullets hit their mark, and puffs of acrid, sulfuric spores bellowed from punctured mushrooms. Then, it turned, but never had time to close the distance. The creature ran a few lurching steps toward them, nearly stumbling. One of the soldiers aimed for the back of the skull, or where a skull would be, and fired a round that pierced the mass of mushroom. That was the moment when everything seemed to truly change. A cloud of spores billowed off the creature's head. The soldier took aim again, carefully hitting 2 more of the soft mushrooms, but the projectiles barely had an impact. Then, the monster did something that truly horrified the 3 of them. It shrieked, an odd, broken noise that vibrated inside their teeth and brought them to their knees. Something about the sound gave them pain like nothing they had ever known before. With nothing left to do, the soldiers simply emptied their clips, only able to aim with some small hope in their hearts that he might just land a bullet in the beast's brain. Despite the damage inflicted on it, the creature was relentless, running at full speed, its claws rising to rip and flay while the 3 soldiers simply scattered. Running for the tree line, the 3 went their separate ways, dodging the rends of claws as they found safety amongst the denser foliage. The downpour, now almost torrential, brought relief in only one way. As the rain poured in, it washed away the spores that drifted down as a poisonous cloud of reddish purple. Finding an alcove, the soldiers stood in the patter of raindrops, the downpour beating away most of the toxic spore cloud. It wasn't much relief, though. Heedless in their fleeing, They had sucked in precious air, desperate for oxygen and taking the poison instead. It burned their throats and made their tongues swell. Parker and Chen stumbled away from the thick haze, crawling, reaching and escaping from the other side, leaving Anderson behind. A shadow moved over the outlier, and the last thing he saw was a flash of a scale-covered foot, and then a scythe of bone-covered spikes as it pinned them to the ground. Barely escaping, the remaining two dashed for the trees, their lungs burned, faces still numb. They knew their crew member would be dead by nightfall. After all, they'd seen the sloppily chewed through parts of the agronomist with sickening clarity, but they were alive, and that had to count for something. Once they broke the tree line, they tripped but caught themselves. Luckily, the ground was muddy enough to sink in a bit and give some softness. That was when Lieutenant Chen stopped to catch her breath, doubled over and wheezing. She didn't take notice of Parker sinking to his knees, groaning into the dirt until it was too late. Fungals were sprouting up around his fingernails, breaking open so that puffy white heads full of spores danced in the wind. Instinctively, she backed up, only seeing her crewmate's body disappearing under the fluffy mass. His face morphing into a screaming rictus, eyes gone. It left only two glimmering darknesses in the middle of a face that was turning more and more stiff with every minute. "Parker!" she gasped, horrified. He made a sound in response. She'd remember it for the rest of her life. Parker reached for her, and Chen stumbled back, barely staying upright. She took off running again, her fellow soldiers straggling behind her. Her sides burned. Every movement sent a wave of lightning crackling down from her ribcage, threatening to pin her. Somehow, her fear of her crewmate, someone she had worked beside for years, was sharper, more visceral than the fear of the creatures. Maybe because she knew him, knew the man he had been just minutes ago, and knew that he had faith she might help him. She wouldn't. Instead, she made her way back to camp. Chen didn't know when Parker had finally fallen, or what became of Anderson, and she had never looked back to check. All she knew was that, when she threw herself back across the camp borders, she was alone. There, she tried to explain what had happened, shouting her story until it echoed. The scientists pulled her into one of the tents, putting water into her shaking hands and helping her guide the bottle to her mouth. When she caught her breath, she grit out, "He's still out there." "Who?" the head biologist, Helen Greer, asked, kneeling in front of her. "Who is coming?" "Lieutenant Parker." Her eyes burned. "He was right behind me, but it's eating him alive." Helen had opened her mouth to ask for more details, but then the general was there, throwing the door of the outfitter tent open and letting it swing on its hinges. "This is my subordinate, Dr. Greer. I'll take her from here." Helen shook her head, gray curls bouncing. "No, I need to get information from her." The general's jaw worked, anger rolling off of him in waves. "You don't have any authority over the lieutenant here. I do. We need her to find Parker and Anderson." "He's one of the things," she hissed. "Parker and Anderson, it took them and that agronomist, Fred, I think too. But it ate Fred." Everyone in the room, members of the crews assigned to Ignatius for habitation, were looking at each other and waiting. The silence became an uncomfortable, unsettling thing, creeping down around them. As it continued on, the soldier found her shoulders shrinking up towards her ears, as if she was trying to ward off a blow, but no one said anything. General Kruger opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but held back, staring her down. "Go on," Helen prompted. "Tell me more." Her voice was hoarse when she broke her silence. "We got separated. Something happened out there, and by the time I noticed, the other two were already... I saw Doctor. I saw that they were dead." Pushing the general out of the way, the biologist handed her a pad of paper and a pen. "Draw what you saw." And she did, in shaking lines. To the biologist, it looked like, somehow, a Deinonychus, one that had been left out in the marshlands to rot, fungus taking hold. It was horrific, but there was sense in the madness of it, something that the biologist recognized. Once Helen was done with Chen, everyone who had been lingering to listen filed on, leaving the soldier alone in the tent with the general. He paced in front of her for some time, finally gritting out, "Do you know how much it will fuck things up for me if we have to leave this mission early, Lieutenant? The two last explorations I had failed. I am not letting this one go too." "Sir, it wasn't my intention." Then, very calmly, struck the side of her head. Chen sucked in a breath of pain but didn't move, afraid that worse was to come. The general walked out as if nothing had happened, but by morning her face was swollen, but no one asked why. It's likely they already knew. It was 2 days before Chen was approved to take a research team out to the area where she had seen the creature. The sky was the right side of dark gray, light peeking out beneath the clouds. Underfoot, ferns were shimmering brilliantly, both in shadow and in spots where pale light graced their verdant heads. The ground around them gave easily, squelching and sinking, even under their boots. As they searched, they chatted about what they would do when they made it home, eager to return to the dying planet Earth that didn't threaten to consume them whole. Lieutenant Chen was silent. They reached the spot where Fred had met his end by looking at the bright rust and slick green ooze on the ground. While the others hung back, Chen moved forward, E-tool in her hand, ready to give whatever remained a proper burial. There was nothing left to retrieve. She waited until the rest of the party had started to move and said a short prayer over the spot of slime and death. It was all she could offer. They continued searching, looking for anything that could indicate the remains of Parker or Anderson. Instead, there were just pieces of their things, weapons, a bag, but not a body. Finally, they found evidence of Parker, though. A fairy ring in the shape of a man, dusty white and mildewed. The ground stank of rot. For a while, the team rested, eyes scanning the surroundings until someone sighted something. It was rushing at them, head on. With alarm, they all clustered together, pointing out more shapes coming at them, slowly, as if death was stalking them. Before the things could reach them, some of the growths on their spines popped open, tossing poisonous spores over their heads. Everyone jumped up, scrambling out of the way and trying to find higher ground. They made it to a cliffside, but the fungal raptors circled below, kicking at the edges and waiting. With gunfire, high ground, and the blood of the dinosaur predators on their faces, the soldiers drove them off, screaming as if victory had just been handed to them. Victory, though, is almost always short-lived. On one side of war, there are winners, but on the other, the ones that were pushed back would wait for their chance to enact revenge. Over the following days, there was silence from the fungal raptors. Everyone watched the tree line, gnats filling the hazy red air, but everything stayed silent. They counted down the days, looking towards the skies, but their work was still there on Ignatius. At the campsite, they had to go about their work, cataloging the flora, fauna, and minerals that the planet had to offer. It was their duty. So when she had a moment of freedom, Lieutenant Chen made her way back to the forest, alone. Something drew her there. She mused on the idea that it was spores she had sucked into her lungs, lying in wait to drive her into the trees. It was the third time that week that she had found herself venturing into the forest by herself. She was careful, watching the trees and listening for the telltale sounds that would indicate the presence of the raptors. Her training had not prepared her for this kind of horror. Chen's boots sank into the wet ground as she walked, her feet sliding a bit. The mud had turned from brown to black. In some places it was red. In the distance, there was the sound of thunder, or perhaps an explosion. It sounded like a war, and the soldier thought of her family. Her family was back on Earth, her father and her little sister. She wondered what they would think if they knew what was happening on Ignatius. Her father, a soldier himself, would understand, she was sure. What they would think if they saw her now, covered in mud and blood, her hair matted, and her uniform torn. Would they be proud, or would they be afraid? Chen paused, the wet earth giving way. It was like stepping into a grave. Fog curled around her. She looked down, her heart hammering. Something was moving beneath the surface. It was a hand. Fingers curled into claws as if the person were trying to dig their way out of their own grave. The soldier felt sick, bile rising in her throat. She stepped back, her foot coming free from the mud with a wet sucking sound. The hand disappeared, sinking back into the mud. Chen stood there, frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. What had she just seen? Had it been real, or had it been a trick of the light? Maybe her imagination. She took a deep breath and then continued walking. Her boots squelched and her heart was still beating a frantic rhythm in her chest. As she walked, the sound of thunder grew louder, and the smell of brimstone filled the air. She quickened her pace, the forest suddenly feeling ominous and dangerous. She had to get back to camp. She had to warn the others. The job of finding her lost companions was far from her mind now. In time, she came across a river, the water murky and filled with debris. She could see bodies floating downstream, their faces distorted and unrecognizable. Some were missing limbs or their heads. Chen watched the river for a moment, a strange numbness filling her. She felt disconnected, like she was watching a movie instead of living the reality. She sucked in the air, and it smelled to her like gasoline and the copper taste of pennies. And then she held her breath until her lungs burned. When she opened her eyes again, the river was clear. Something in the air was making her hallucinate. Just before her body made her suck in another breath, Chen saw the shadows of something skeletal and massive slipping past her, almost close enough to touch. But when she drew air into her body, it disappeared. The soldier took a step back, her mind reeling. What was happening? Was this all just a nightmare? She held her breath again, and after a few long seconds, the air shimmered around her and the water was once more empty. And she got her second look at the thing slinking in the corners of her vision, an acrid smoke billowing from a head the size of a barrel. It turned, slow and lumbering, and she saw that it was only a skull, the hollow of the eyes black, smoke pouring out, thick and viscous. Chen inhaled despite herself, and the bone creature was gone once again. The soldier stood there, breathing heavily, her mind racing. What was she seeing? Was it real, or was it just another hallucination? She stared into the water, watching the bodies float by, hysteria rising inside of her. She thought of her family and wondered if they would ever know what had happened to her. The heavy booms. They were footsteps of the things she couldn't see. It felt like a war zone, and the soldier couldn't help but wonder if it was. Lieutenant Chen crashed through the trees, holding her breath when she could, and avoiding the skeletal, lumbering quadrupeds. With every meter she gained, she felt the smoke get thicker, and she became more and more unsure of her surroundings. And finally, she broke through the tree line. The forest was burning. The flames were high and the heat was intense. The smoke was thick and black, and the screams were deafening. She faltered, her legs weak and her lungs burning. She tried to run, but her feet were heavy, and the air was so clotted that it was hard to breathe. She collapsed, her body convulsing and her vision blurred. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She lay there, the fire burning around her, her body shaking. She closed her eyes, and the last thing she saw was the skeletal quadruped standing over her, its empty eyes burning into hers. The camp wasn't burning, but it was in turmoil, two sides emerging while panic started to mount. On one side were the ones that wanted to go back for Lieutenant Chen. The others were the ones that wanted to get the fuck off the planet, mission be damned. The infighting was so severe that no one noticed when the first person disappeared, a cafeteria cook, until they returned hours later. Lower jaw missing, a clean, half-moon chunk bitten from their left thigh, tongue hanging loose, and mushrooms sprouting from any soft or open area on their body. No one noticed when a soldier slipped into the trees and didn't come back either. And then another, and another. The cook was put down like a rabid dog. They didn't get time to bury him before the fungus consumed him. People were slaughtered that night, eaten alive by the fungal raptors, or wandering off into the forest as if led by some alien Pied Piper. Factions sprang up, clumping together in small bands of survivors. Overhead, the sky was clear for the first time in days, the fat, red disk of the distant star like an ember as it set behind the trees. Not that anyone paid attention to the beauty of it. Rations were unpacked, guns were handed out. There wasn't much by way of ammunition, but there was enough blunt objects to fell 100 raptors. Would it be enough? For the first time since the colony was settled and construction completed, the facility was quiet. Now hunkered together to form two small groups, the scientists and the soldiers watched each other from different areas of the mess hall tent. They were too frightened to return to their individual areas. Somewhere in the night, someone screamed. People ran for cover, but unburdened by the weight of gear and supplies, the person on the other side of the room lopped forward, catching and lifting the overbalancing form of a young botanist. And the thing that had her, what they first thought was one of the raptors, made up of a twisted conglomerate of fungus and broken, yellow bone, let out a grinding, screeching sort of call. And then it dropped the frightened botanist. The botanist looked up, and seeing into the face of what held him, gagged and began to sob. Lieutenant Chen looked awful. Under the gunk and mud, she was very clearly rotting alive, and her left shoulder was more mushroom than meat. On the other side of the atrium, someone started screaming, a high-pitched sound of terror in the otherwise quiet room. They just waited, weapons at the ready, and watched. And in turn, Chen watched them from the other side of the huge room, but she never moved to join them. The last time the soldiers had seen her, she had been heading toward the forest to do some field work, but she'd never returned until now, stinking and oozing. It wasn't until a little while later that she began to speak. At first, they thought that maybe her voice had been damaged because it sounded garbled and wrong. She told them about the monsters. "They're going to consume us all." She went on to describe how the fungal raptors were using the network of caves beneath the facility to move unseen through the area around them, and then how, once they were dead, the fungus would spread from their bodies and eventually consume the entire colony. No one really knew what to make of her words, but they could all tell that she was serious. She was genuinely trying to warn them. The only question was whether or not they should believe her. No one trusted her. After all, she had gone into the forest and returned like something out of a nightmare. But what choice was there? They agreed that the best place to be was on higher ground. In the distance, the bone walkers waited, fungal raptors moving restlessly between their legs. With an echoing, droning sound, the walkers shook their heads, and smoke began to pour forth. Chen smiled to herself. She didn't breathe anymore, so the world was clear and true for her as she led the camp to the tallest nearby point on the planet. The dark sun dipped below the horizon. The air shimmered ruby and blood, and the survivors sucked the smoke into their lungs, unaware. They could hear the clicking, chattering sounds of the raptors, but what they saw was an empty forest, the toxic smoke obscuring reality. The fungal raptors waited, and waited, and waited, and struck. There was a lot of screaming. Chen closed what was left of her eyelids, but she heard the sounds of battle. She could smell the smoke and the rot. She could hear the voices of the people she had once called friends, the crack of gunfire, the wet sound of feeding as people were torn, bones broken and pulled apart like a slaughterhouse chicken. She heard them pleading. She heard them crying out in pain. But she couldn't bring herself to help them. There wasn't anything left of her that could. Purpose completed, she melted to her knees, cracked palms in the dirt, her body already being consumed by the fungal raptors. Chen was just a voice and a pair of eyes, floating in the ether between life and death. When her soul was finally eaten, it felt like an age had passed before the screams stopped, before the bone walkers consumed her soul, leaving her with nothing. And then the pain began. It was excruciating, like her very existence was being slowly torn apart. The very fiber of her existence, shredded and devoured, left nothing but darkness behind. chaos reigned and became a battle. The soldiers and the scientists bolted through the forest, seeing hell in the trees. Bodies hanging from the branches, wearing the faces of their families back on Earth. The light darkened to the color of dried gore, and still they ran. They fought, too, shooting and charging the raptors at every chance, but it was still an abattoir. The fungal raptors screeched, and when they died, they released clouds of poison spores like a mushroom puffing up. Not many of them died, though. Humans fell and were consumed. Some of them broke through the trees as the full dark fell. There, a bone walker watched them, smoke pouring from empty eye sockets, its 4 legs the length of telephone poles, making the ground tremble. A trio of people stood back to back, guns outstretched. It was impossible not to see them tremble, and in that moment, reflected by the terror in their faces, a realization dawned on them. They were not the hunters. They never had been. The only thing that was saved was a thin sliver of hope, and they ran. On they dashed, falling and dragging each other. Some crawled forward on elbows and hands, blinded by panic. It was the closest to a retreat that they would be allowed. Swarming like so many wasps, the fungal raptors came down upon them, heads tilted towards the sky, and guttural warbles rolling from their throats. They were swift and sure, jaws clamping down and sinking down on soft flesh, rending and pulling and consuming. Those that didn't fall beneath their jaws couldn't escape the clouds of spores, the fungus obliterating their cells one by one. Horrible capped things bloomed on their bodies like terrible flowers. Unhurried, the bone walkers tramped through the field of carrion, dipping their ivory heads and scooping the remainder, fungus and all, into their maws. A massacre always has an end, and in time the field grew silent. Miles away, the camp sat empty. What was left of the people who had come simply for work died an unknowable distance from their homes, decaying into the soil of a faraway world. The mycelium beneath the ground, the vascular system of the planet itself, absorbed them. In a way, it was a form of rebirth.